Lucy and I will be reading from 1 Kings 3, 5 through 14.
The king went to Gibeon, the most prestigious of the local shrines, to worship. He sacrificed 1,000 whole burnt offerings on that altar. That night, there in Gibeon, God appeared to Solomon in a dream. God said, "What can I give you? Ask."
So Solomon said, "You were extravagantly generous in love with David, my father, and he lived faithfully in your presence. His relationships were just and his heart right. And you have persisted in this great and generous love by giving him, and this very day, a son to sit on his throne. So now here I am, God, my God. You have made me your servant, ruler of the kingdom in the place of David, my father. I'm too young for this, a mere child. I don't know the ropes, hardly know the ins and outs of this job. Here I am, set down in the middle of the people you have chosen, a great people, far too many to ever count. Here's what I want. Give me a God-listening heart so I can lead your people well, discerning the difference between good and evil, for who on their own is capable of leading your glorious people."
God the Master was delighted with Solomon's response, and God said to him, "Because you have asked for this and haven't grasped after a long life or riches or the doom of your enemies, but you have asked for the ability to lead and govern well, I'll give you what you've asked for. I'm giving you a wise and mature heart. There's never been one like you before, and there'll be no one after. As a bonus, I'm giving you both the wealth and glory you didn't ask for. There's not a king anywhere who will come up to your mark. And if you stay on course, keeping your eye on the life map and the God signs as your father David did, I'll also give you a long life."
We're going to read some more parables now from Matthew 13. If you have your Bibles, Matthew 13, verses 13 to 33, and then later 44 to 46. So, Jesus replied, "You have been given insight into God's kingdom. You know how it works. Not everybody has this gift, this insight. It hasn't been given to them. Whenever someone has a ready heart for this, the insights and understandings flow freely. But if there is no readiness, any trace of receptivity soon disappears. That's why I tell stories, to create readiness, to nudge the people toward the receptive insight. In their present state, they can stare till doomsday and not see it. Listen till they're blue in the face and not get it. I don't want Isaiah's forecast repeated all over again."
Your ears are open, but you don't hear a thing. Your eyes are awake, but you don't see a thing. The people are blockheads. They stick their fingers in their ears so they won't have to listen. They screw their eyes shut so they won't have to look. And so they won't have to deal with me face to face and let me heal them. But you have God-blessed eyes, eyes that see, and God-blessed ears, ears that hear. A lot of people, prophets, and humble believers among them, would have given anything to see what you are seeing, to hear what you are hearing, but never had the chance.
So study the story of the farmer planting seed. When anyone hears news of the kingdom and doesn't take it in, it just remains on the surface. And so the evil one comes along and plucks it right out of that person's heart. This is the seed the farmer scatters on the road. The seed cast in the gravel, this is the person who hears and instantly responds with enthusiasm. But there is no soil of character. And so when the emotions wear off and some difficulty arrives, there is nothing to show for it. The seed cast in the weeds is the person who hears the kingdom news, but the weeds of worry and illusions about getting more and wanting everything under the sun strangle what was heard, and nothing comes of it. The seed cast on good earth is the person who hears and takes in the news, then produces a harvest beyond his wildest dreams.
He told another story. God's kingdom is like a farmer who planted good seed in his field. That night, while his hired men were asleep, His enemy sowed thistles all through the wheat and slipped away before dawn. When the first green shoots appeared and the grain began to form, the thistles showed up too. The farm hands came to the farmer and said, "Master, that was clean seed you planted, wasn't it? Where did the thistles come from?" He answered, "Some enemy did this." The farm hands asked, "Should we weed out the thistles?" He said, "No. If you weed the thistles, you'll pull up the wheat too. Let them grow together until harvest time. Then I'll instruct the harvesters to pull up the thistles and tie them in bundles for the fire, then gather the wheat and put it in the barn."
Another story. God's kingdom is like a pine nut that a farmer plants. It is quite small as seeds go, but in the course of years it grows into a huge pine tree, and eagles build nests in it. Another story. God's kingdom is like the yeast that a woman works into the dough for dozens of loaves of barley bread and waits while the dough rises.
God's kingdom is like a treasure hidden in a field for years and then accidentally found by a trespasser. The finder is ecstatic. What a find! And proceeds to sell everything he owns to raise money and buy that field. Or God's kingdom is like a jewel merchant on the hunt for excellent pearls. Finding one that is flawless, he immediately sells everything and buys it.
Thanks, Del and Lucy. I'm not sure what kind of week you folks have had. For me, I've loved the weather in the past week. We were talking about this before the service started. I'll take plus 40 and air conditioning over minus 40 and heat in the house any day. So in some ways, it's been really awesome to have the kind of weather we've had. It's also been kind of a reflective week for me. And I think that sort of comes from a number of different places. For one, there's been this big pendulum swing in terms of the numbers in Manitoba, right? When we're talking about the pandemic, we had 13 days of no new cases, and the active cases were coming down and we got down to 1, and I could sort of feel everybody in the province kind of holding their breath that day 14 would have us at 0 active cases. And in the end, day 14 marked the beginning of a bunch of new cases. And so we had 13 days of no new cases, and then we've had 13 days now where we've totaled 64 new cases and active cases. And so that's sort of been playing in my head a little too. And what does that look like? I've also had a number of conversations with friends and my niece who's now back from New Zealand, and we've ended up talking about timeline because these are people that I haven't talked to or seen, and we're doing the socially distancing thing, sitting across the patio from one another, and or sitting across the fence. In the case of my niece, she's on one side of the fence and I can see her face through little holes, and we talk on the other side there. And we've been talking timeline and trying to remember just how much has changed and how much has happened. And in one of the conversations, and I think I brought it up here, right? Like it's hard to remember that the fires in Australia, which was the only thing we were talking about, happened this year. That was a 2020 event, and yet that seems like ages ago. It seems like forever since we've had sports or school or sort of that regular life kind of stuff. And I think for a number of people, we're falling into a bit of that COVID fatigue, right? Where we're missing people and we're maybe not being quite as diligent about some of the social distancing things that we were doing or the sanitizing that we were doing, right? I know that there were people who were wiping everything down when they went grocery shopping, wiping everything down when they brought it home before they put it in the fridge, and maybe not doing that quite as much these days. But 4 months has been a long time, and it's been over 4 months already that we've been doing this. And it feels especially long, I think, because there were some of us who were thinking it wasn't actually going to last that long. I mean, I can remember being in conversations with people where they thought, oh yeah, by Easter, the church doors will be open again and kids will be back at school. And we're sitting here in the second half of July, and it seems funny to think that we thought we would be back at church by Easter time. I even know one friend whose church decided that they were going to follow the Julian calendar this year because that made Easter a little later. They thought for sure they'd be back in the building if they just had to wait another week or two. And that didn't work out for them either. So we've moved from, in the last 4 months, we moved from this, or at least I did, from this survival mode, this just dig in deep and just wait for it to be over kind of mode, to finding new habits and doing things differently. And I've been starting to think about, what does that mean in terms of my own life, and how is my life going to change, and how's my life going to be different? Because we're in a long haul, and even as it changes and it loosens up, although Ryan, I remember you saying last week that, Ryan and Kristen, that you guys are going back into, or you have gone back into lockdown, right? Like there's either a second wave or this first wave is ramped up again. So what does that look like for us as we start to think about life long term? And I've been thinking about that a little bit. What is my life going to look like? How is the world going to look? How is it going to be different? And in what ways do I maybe want it to look and be different as we go forward? I think the pandemic so far has shown us lots of sides of ourselves and of society, of our character, of our values, of our priorities. And the first lines of the book, A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, has been floating in my head recently. And it's going to be familiar, right? It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. And it goes on, because that's only the first third of the first sentence of that novel. And you really need to love Dickens and Victorian literature to get into that kind of thing. And I do, but that's not the point. But this quote has sort of come to my mind recently in the last couple of weeks. And I feel like in some ways it represents the time that we're in really well, just as well as it fit the cities of London and Paris in 1859. The pandemic has shown us, I think, the best of ourselves in the ways in which we've cared for one another. We've shown love for one another in the way, people are staying home, and the extra cleaning procedures, wearing masks when leaving the house, the extra care that the most vulnerable and disenfranchised, or the attention that they're getting, and the attention they're getting, and the fact that they need more from us, and people extending themselves in order to show that kind of care and that kind of help. So in some ways we're seeing the best of ourselves, but we're not only seeing the best of ourselves. The pandemic is also showing us some of the worst of ourselves too. Partisan politics pitting people against one another, fear causing people to treat others really poorly and call others out. And I think about Hutterite communities, not just in Manitoba, but across Western Canada, and the kind of grief that they're getting now that it's become public, that there's been little outbreaks in some of the colonies, not just here, but also further further west in the provinces. And people, because they're an identifiable minority, there are people treating them quite poorly, refusing them service in stores and restaurants, and hollering at them in parking lots, and calling them out and shaming them. And there are stories where there's just been downright cruel treatment of these people that comes from a place of fear, right? And without other distractions, we've been confronted with the violence and injustices that exist and occur around us, not merely to us, but around us all the time. So like the video capturing the murder of George Floyd is not the first of its kind, but it was maybe the first that was seen at a time when there was nothing else to distract us. It was COVID-19 lockdown and this video. There was no sports, there was no movies or other kinds of entertainment, no heading back to work in the same way. Our days were not full, and suddenly this video filled it. If you were online or watching TV, didn't matter where you turned, it was there, it was present. And it became one of the straws that broke the camel's back, or perhaps it's the moment that mobilized a people. And so this pandemic has caused me to wrestle with my evolving understanding of humanity and of the world as it exists. And no worries, I'm not falling into a pit of despair here, but I am kind of recognizing how small and safe my specific bubble really is. And I'm recognizing that maybe it's not okay anymore for me to only live in my safe, well-ordered bubble. The world outside is messier and more broken. I'm not sure more broken than I realize, but certainly at the very least, much messier and more broken than I hope for people, than I hope it will be. And I think ultimately recognizing this is good. It's good for me. I think it's good for us if we're willing to engage it. I think some of the reflectiveness of my week comes from the message that we had from our guest speaker last week from MCC, Carrie Sainer Harvey. And if you haven't had a chance to watch the video, it's up on our YouTube channel and you should check it out. It's totally worth it. In sort of 20 words or less, or maybe 100 words or less, he focused on Psalm 85 and specifically verse 10. And it speaks about mercy and truth as partners and justice and peace as partners, and how these four act as points of tension. And it's at the meeting place of these four where reconciliation can take place. And he was talking specifically about reconciliation with Indigenous people in Canada, but it speaks more broadly to that, right? And he mentioned, or he points out that while these are partners, they don't necessarily always work easily or well together. And then he brings in the analogy of baking bread. I am not an experienced bread maker. I've used a bread making machine. That's the extent of my bread making expertise, but I trust the people who've done this more than I have. And I've learned that when making a dough, sometimes it matters what order the ingredients get added. And not all of the ingredients in a dough necessarily naturally would mix well or blend well together. Dough needs an active ingredient. It needs an agitator of some kind, right? It needs yeast. Dough needs to be worked. It also needs to be rested, right? We tuck it in and we let it sit in a nice warm place and we let it rise. And it takes a lot of time. I remember watching my Oma bake buns and make pasca and recognizing that baking bread is not for the faint of heart. There was a reason why her arms were so strong. It was all that bread she was making all the time. And I tried, a few years ago, I thought, you know, I was going to actually, I was going to make some pasca. I'd never made pasca before. I still haven't, because I took one look at this recipe and realized how much time it was going to take and how much work it was going to be, and decided, yeah, no, this is just not for me. So in many ways, this whole sourdough frenzy, this whole bread making frenzy that's taken off during the pandemic also seems to me like a really good motif for the time that we're in, for the pandemic. It started because people had time and they were bored. And as I learned from Jesse Wiens, it also comes from a more instinctive place than that. Our body craves carbs in times of stress. And if I remember the lesson correctly, and she's not here, so her parents are gonna have to check with her to make sure I got this right. But if I remember what she was teaching me, if I remember it correctly, it's because carbs actually help to bring down the cortisol amounts that we have in our body. And we produce cortisol in ridiculous amounts when we're stressed. The more stress we have, the more cortisol we produce. And carbs actually help to reduce that. So carbs actually help to physiologically manage stress in some ways. So while the baking bread may have come out of boredom or maybe a craving, because who doesn't want fresh homemade bread? It also comes from a more basic, intuitive, physiological place as well, where our body is trying to help us find homeostasis, to find balance, to reduce our stress. So baking bread is this reminder or this hearkening to a simple time, a simpler time, and to a time that that was a time of necessity, right? Where we do things out of necessity. And maybe it's one of those things that sticks around, right? This wanting to do things more simply, to wanting to do more hands-on. Maybe this is something that sticks with us. And this analogy has been a helpful one for me to think about, because I often get caught up thinking that the building blocks of the kingdom of God and that work that we're invited to should fit together easily and well, like a puzzle, right? When you're doing a puzzle, when you find the two pieces that fit together, it's smooth and it's easy. And it's when you're trying to jam pieces together, because I do that, and you try to jam pieces together that don't actually fit, it doesn't look right and it doesn't work and it's hard. And I get bothered. I get bothered by the tension and the resistance of this work that we're invited to. I get bothered by the fact that it feels like it sometimes gets worse before it gets better. I get weary of how hard it can be and how long it can take, and even how not peaceful this work can feel sometimes. And so this idea that transformation is hard work has been a good reminder for me. It takes time, it takes effort. It takes that work. It also takes rest. And that's been a helpful reminder for me. And maybe we add to that, because of what I learned from Jesse, it takes thought, but it also takes some intuition, right? And I think that's where that Solomon, or the King's passage where we learn about Solomon comes in and links really well. You've got a prayer that Solomon is speaking about the work that he's about to embark in, or that's his to do. And he prays for a discerning heart. And as I studied the passage this week a little bit, I learned that it's often translated as Solomon asking for understanding, asking to hear justice. And I thought there was something really powerful about that phrase, that he's praying to hear justice. So here's this young man asking God to guard and direct his heart so that he can discern what is right, not necessarily to reward what is right and punish what is wrong, but rather to have this heart that hears justice, that can address the injustices and make the injustices right. There's a sense that he already knows, I think, right? That the work he's being called to is going to be challenging. It's going to be hard for him. And he's going to be hearing challenging stories of injustice and victimization and wrong. Stories that are going to make him uncomfortable, uncertain, maybe even angry. And at his young age, in preparation for this difficult work of ruling, he recognizes that the need for his heart to be involved, the need for his heart to be a listening heart, a heart of discernment, a heart of understanding. And I wonder what ways that we can do that too. What are the ways that we can nurture a heart to hear justice in the same way? And then I think about the Matthew passage, the parables that Delphi read for us. And they're about ordinary, everyday activities, right? And it seems like the fact that they're all these ordinary, everyday activities are inviting us to see that the signs of kingdom building, the kingdom work that God is doing, are happening in the ordinary, everyday moments of our lives. And so that invitation to recognize that God is at work even in the mundane parts of our lives. And the parables also use really ordinary, everyday, small, almost invisible objects as well, right? That we could find almost anywhere. And so these parables pile up, and it feels like there's a lot to wrestle with and a lot to untangle, and yet they sort of head us in a really specific direction, or in a tangible or recognizable direction. This idea of remarkable growth from insignificant beginnings. The pandemic has shown us how something small and invisible to the eye can grow in really negative ways, right? Grow rapidly, exponentially even, into a destructive force that consumes all of our attention and all of our resources. It consumes us as individuals, as communities, as nations, and as a world. And then we have these passages, we have these parables that offer a counter image, as it were, to that destructive force. The parables show us how the kingdom of heaven emerges from something almost invisible to the eye too. And it too can grow exponentially and offer us sustenance and a treasure that is worthy of all of our attention and all of our resources. I think we're often really adept at seeing God's handiwork in certain parts of our lives, right? Especially in nature. It doesn't take long for us to head out into nature, be it camping or a cabin or just out for a hike somewhere. And we stand there and we can be in awe, recognizing that we find ourselves surrounded by God's beauty, by God's handiwork. And we have these moments where we're feeling we're on holy or sacred ground. I wonder if we can begin to do the same thing when we encounter injustices around us. But we can start to see God's handiwork in those moments as well. And we can see God's invitation in those moments as well. Can we do the same when we sit and listen and receive the stories of injustices from our beloved siblings in Christ, from the hurting, broken neighbor who's seeking justice, who's seeking restitution and wholeness? Carrie mentioned it last week, and it's worth repeating. We are living in a time where we are being invited to hear the stories of others and to look for God's breaking in and bringing of hope and grace into those stories and into a broken world. And I think that some of the important work that we have to do in order to be participant in the kingdom building is to first sit with and listen to those stories of brokenness and injustice and harm. And we need to do that before we can come up with all the solutions to answer it all. It's in listening that hopefully we can also see in a new way that God is at work, and God is already at work nurturing healing and wholeness. And maybe this is true especially in this time where we are being laid bare, in a time when we are in this pandemic and we're wrestling with what that means. And I feel like I'm starting to launch into a long quote and discussion on Esther, when her uncle tells her, you know, you are here for such a time as this, and I'm not. I'm gonna stop here instead. But it seems true somehow. We have an opportunity to make some intentional choices, to embark on some intentional change in this time, about the way we live our own lives, about what's important, about how we engage with others. The world is changing, and we have an opportunity to work in that change, to work for growth, to work in hope alongside God in that work. And to ask the question, what do we want to see and how do we want to be a part of it? It's my hope that we, like Solomon, will continue to pray for a discerning heart, a heart that hears justice. And may we, like the woman baking bread, continue to do the good work of kingdom building, even with blocks as small as mustard seeds or yeast. Amen. We have a second song from Lauren that I'll play for you now. Nope. Very good.
Oh, healing river, send down your waters, send down your waters upon this land. Oh, healing river, send down your waters and wash the blood from off of the sand. This land is parching, this land is burning, no seed is growing in the barren land. Oh, healing river, send down your waters sun.